Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kohler Group's Expansion into China webinar series. This is part 9 of 10 webinar sessions we have been hosting to help foreign investors with their market entry and expansion within the Chinese territory. I am pleased to have Mrs. Mariah Paulo, Director of the European American Market and Overseas Investment Projects at A&Z Law Firm, talk about today's topic, which is anti-bribery and anti-corruption regulations and enforcement in China. This webinar will be divided into 4 parts. The first part briefly reviews key legal concepts, and it also provides an overview of the global enforcement and compliance trends. In the second part, we introduce the legal context in China and the anti-corruption campaigns. The seminar then explores the frequent bribery vehicles and will describe the anti-bribery legal framework and enforcement trends. The last section of this webinar will cover the compliance program, monitoring, and due diligence, as well as the responding to non-compliances. Finally, we will draw together some tentative conclusions. But before we begin today's session, I would just like to make sure that we're not having any technical difficulties. If you would be so kind as to click the hand button in your control panel, that will allow me to know that the sound system is functioning. If I or Mariah are having any audio technical difficulties, please don't exit the webinar. It will take a few seconds up to a few minutes for the sound system to return, so please do stay on the line. If you are having any audio difficulties, note that in your control panel there is a section entitled Audio where you can switch from mic and speakers of your computer to the telephone landline. Now, as is typical with any webinar series that Kohler Group holds, we like to have an interactive Q&A. Don't be shy. Insert your questions and comments into the questions section of the control panel, and we will ask the questions at the end of the presentation. For those of you that are new to our webinar series, allow me to introduce who we are. Kohler Group is a CSC company. We have over 10 offices located in 3 jurisdictions: Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. We've been established since 1979 and have just over 120 professionals located throughout our 10 offices. Our objective is to help foreign companies with all compliance and administrative functions concerning market entry and operations within the 3 jurisdictions that we operate in. One of our unique advantages is that we speak over 10 languages internally and are able to communicate with our clients in their mother tongue. A little bit about myself. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm a director at Kohler Group, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I've been working with Kohler Group since 2003 when I opened our first Shanghai office, and have expanded our China operations to having 8 offices within the territory. I've been helping foreign investors with their market entry, their expansion within the Chinese territory, and in some instances also their liquidations and exits from the market. As of late, I've been helping clients with their expansions into the ASEAN region as well. Kohler Group publishes numerous resources on their website and through a weekly e-newsletter. All of it is complimentary, and if you're interested in subscribing, it can be easily done so on our homepage by inserting your email address into the section entitled ChinaInvest.biz Information Series. Now, without further ado, let us begin today's presentation. Mariah? We're just waiting for Mariah to come on. It seems that she logged off from the telephone line. Just one moment, everybody. Mariah?
Hello, Christina. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your introduction and also for your invitation. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to our listeners, wherever they might be. I'm delighted to share with you this afternoon in Shanghai the current topic that I think is highly important to companies operating in China or with Chinese companies. I have found in my past 10 years working in or with China that very often many people that found a bit difficult to understand Chinese environment, particularly for the legal framework and enforcement, and that's due to the differences with other jurisdictions. So this impacts quite significantly in how they should think about their strategy in China, whether they are about enter China, whether they are currently on the ground looking for improvement, their strategy. So if we move to the next slide, as Cristina mentioned before, for those who doesn't know me, I'm Maria Paulo. I'm Director of the European American Market and Overseas Investment Projects here in ANC Law Firm. ANC Law Firm is a Chinese law firm. We are now located in Shanghai, where I'm calling. We basically provide legal services for both Chinese and foreign corporates operating in China, but also for Chinese corporates doing overseas investments. And our practice, could you, Cristina, move this to the other slide? Basically, our practices is legal services that corporates require. And I don't want to hesitate too much in this introduction, so I would like to start and move on by asking the audience two questions. The first one it will be, suppose your company has a sales director that allows a travel trip paid by the company to a purchasing agent in order to get a new order for the company. So here goes my question to you. Could this be a bribery under Chinese laws and regulations? And another question could be, for example, you have your distributors and you invite them for dinner or to go to KTV, karaoke, or any other activity in order to obtain a better deal. So could this scenario be considered as bribery under China's laws and regulations? Well, the aim of this seminar is to respond to these questions and to have a basic understanding of the situation in China. And even more important, I would say, is to learn some takeaways for preventing to violate China's laws and regulations. So I hope that at the end of this webinar, I'm able to show you some key elements that could help you to understand what is in the China's context a bribe or corruption behavior, and even more important, how can you adapt your strategy to avoid this risk. So let's move to the next slide and let's talk a little bit about basic concepts. Because bribery, for example, sometimes might be defined in different ways. Actually, relevant laws has a very wide definition of what is bribe. So usually it has been clarified through judicial interpretation. And for example, in April 2016, Supreme People's Court and Supreme People's Procuratorate set out in Article 12 that a bribe can consist of money, goods, proprietary interest, consistent of benefits, the value of which can be calculated in money, for example, house renovation, the release of a debt, and also tangible benefits. So as you can see, it's still a little bit vague in terms of the definition. So if we move to the next slide, we will see some of the forms that bribery can take in China. Well, here you can see many of them, but common ones, I could say, they are like kickbacks or tangible gifts, entertainment, for example. Those are quite common. However, we cannot forget about the other forms. If we move to the next slide, I would like to go through a little bit what is the Chinese landscape and recent developments. As you know, China has been perceived as a jurisdiction with high corruption risk in which to do business, right? For example, last year in 2016, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranked China in the position 79 out of 167 countries and territories. Having said so, if we compare 2 years ago, the country has improved because before it was in the position 83. However, Chinese government is trying to improve this perception and trying also to combat corruption. So that is one of the main reasons why Xi Jinping spoke in 2013 about tigers and flies in an effort to resolve corruption problems in China. After that, we have seen different anti-corruption campaigns, particularly against officials from the party, and also a repetitive motto, I could say, about promoting the rule of law. Obviously, the rule of law with socialist Chinese characteristics, but nevertheless, this still be on the core of the government's strategic policy. If we move to the next slide, for example, we will see that there are many cases that has been very well known and also covered by the media, and that is quite significant for the party as such. But if those are important, if we move to the next slide, we will say that it's not only party members who has been persecuted. As you know, in China, we have SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and they are under the state arm. Therefore, employees working in those state-owned enterprises will be also considered officials. We will see that later when we talk about the category of bribery. But it's important to remind this SOE role. If we move to the next slide, I wanted to just mention one example, one case of a foreign company. I'm sure most of you hear about it. The company is GlaxoSmithKline. It's a pharmaceutical firm. And this was very well known here in China, at least, because it was a record penalty. The company was fined with 3 billion renminbi. So that will be about 300 million pounds. So the amount, it was quite large. In addition, the detectives in China were also convicted and sentenced to suspended jail terms of up to 4 years. So that was pretty severe also. The allegations were mainly that the company paid out bribes to doctors and hospitals in order to boost the sales of its projects. So usually, healthcare sector or pharmaceutical sector is one of the on the spot, I would say, for this kind of campaigns. If we move to the next slide, I would like to go through the legal framework that we have. And before that, I wanted to ask you also another question. Who has to comply with the law here in China? And that question seems a little bit irrelevant, but it's quite important because there are differences between jurisdictions. So it is quite different between China and other jurisdictions. For example, in China, all companies operating, but also individuals working in China, they must comply with domestic Chinese laws. The same thing for the Chinese individuals and enterprises operating overseas. And what is this relevant? For example, if we compare it with U.S. laws, right? We have the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. Well, the U.S. laws are primarily aimed at bribery by U.S. companies in foreign markets, for example. But in the case of China, it also includes domestic measures such as commercial bribery. Now, as I mentioned before, we will see different categories of briberies in China. Then also another difference is that in China, in the U.S. laws, for example, receipt of a bribe is not a prosecutable offense, but in China it is. So this is quite important to know who has to comply with the law. If we move to the next slide, you will see a table where it mentions key laws to bear in mind for anti-bribery and anti-corruption, and also the agencies that enforce those laws. Here, the two main laws that you need to keep in mind is the criminal law, which was amended. The last amendment was in November in 2015. And the anti-unfair competition law. This one is still now, for example, the comments, the public comments were actually closed this week on the 25th. So we still remain to be seen some of the results. However, we will see some of the key aspects. In terms of the agencies that enforce the laws, I would like to highlight 3 of them, basically, to bear in mind. One is the first one, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, and the reason is because in other jurisdictions we might not have this type of agency. This agency leads the enforcement efforts. It is the party anti-corruption body, and it is empowered to investigate into cases involving breaches of party discipline and state law by party members. And it also, for example, has the power to put under house arrest for investigation any member on the spot. In addition, it is also responsible for implementing a system for the officials to report their personal assets. So it's a very powerful agency. And the other agency that is relevant to mention is the CPP, the Supreme People's Procuratorate. This is the sole judicial organ that investigates and prosecutes corruption cases concerning public servants and state functionaries in China. And also it's the only one that has the power to initiate public prosecution, so it's an irrelevant one. And finally, the third one that I wanted to highlight is it will be very relevant for the corporates. Because SAIC, the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, is in charge of market supervision and regulation, and related also to the law enforcement through administrative means. So it will be an important actor when it comes to the regulation of areas such as business registration, competition, consumer protection, and so on and so forth. So it's important to bear in mind, SAIC and also the local counterparts, right? Because we have the differences between national and provincial levels. If we move to the next slide, you will see some other regulations that could be interesting for you to know. But as they are less relevant, we will move now to the next slide, to the categories of bribery. Categories of briberies, here it's important to highlight or to bear in mind that when we talk in China about anti-bribery and anti-corruption, we talk about 3 types of bribery. The first one is official, the second one is commercial, and the last one is the foreign. We will pay more attention today to the official and the commercial one. However, later on I will highlight a few aspects for the foreign bribery. If we move to the next slide, we have to think another key issue, right? We talk about who is a government official or a state functionary. The distinguishing criteria between a state functionary and a non-state functionary actually is whether this individual is performing public duties. So here we have in the criminal law an article that defines a little bit who could be. For example, it states that a person providing public service in government organs, but as we mentioned here, the role of the SOE is quite significant. So your company might be doing business with any employee from an SOE because usually they still operate in key industries, such as telecommunication, for instance. So that is important to bear in mind. Then if we move to the next slide, also we need to think what is an official bribery. So under the China's criminal law, official bribery is an offense to offer a bribe to a governmental official, as well as to the government officials to receive a bribe. And we will look at this a little bit further when we talk about the amendments. The other key issue to bear in mind is the liability. Because with the amendments in the laws, the liability has been, the scope has been expanded, not only to bribe givers, but also receivers, and not only to entities, but also individuals. So if we move to the next slide, I would like to highlight four main aspects that the latest amendments provide in the criminal law. And what are they? Well, the first one is that the Article 46, I put it in Chinese for those who are able to read it, because it expands what was mentioned in the pre-existing Article 390. And it's basically that it is a crime not only for those functionaries or officials receiving the bribe, but also for close relatives or even other persons that are close to them. So this is quite significant, I would say, change. Also, there are monetary penalties, and those are covered in different articles. So despite other punishments that the person or the entity might receive, and there are also monetary penalties. And this is a big change compared to before, because it also covers individuals and givers and receivers. Then when it comes to the monetary figures, for example, here we have some ambiguities in the wording, because if we more or less translate into English, will be something like relatively large, huge, especially huge. So how much I'm going to be punished in a monetary fine will be determined also by the amount of the bribe or the losses that could be in place. So that will be subject to interpretation, actually. If we move to the next slide, we will enter in the commercial bribery. Actually, before that, because Chinese characteristics, I would like also to highlight us very briefly something, and is that when it comes to official bribery, well, China has laws governing bribes given to state officials. That is true. However, these laws are applied differently than laws that relate to commercial bribery. And why for? Because official briberies obviously involve party members, and the Communist Party has its own internal mechanisms for handling the issue of discipline. And therefore, it will be the party, the one who decides first how to resolve the case internally before handing the case over the legal authorities for formal legal proceedings. So this is a little bit different, obviously, to other jurisdictions. And the two main reasons is because the Communist Party considers itself to be above the law and outside the legal system. And also, another reason will be that the party member can result in a potential embarrassment for the party, right? So here, the tide control will be higher, obviously, because the ultimate goal of the party is not to punish, is to punish a corrupt official, so one person, in order to set an example for the others, but also for society, for the citizens. But obviously, we'll try to avoid to seem all the members guilty, right? And one example that just popped up into my mind is the case of Joe Yongkan. He was a former Politburo Standing Committee member, and actually was sentenced to life imprisonment for bribery 2 years ago in June 2015. Well, if we move now to commercial bribery, I think this point will be also highly important for many of you, particularly for businesses, because you might need to pay more attention to this briberies. And then we need to understand what is commercial bribery. So in cases in China, it involves persons who are not state officials, but rather those who act in a private capacity, right? So, for example, here again, both criminal law and the anti-fair competition law covers commercial bribery. So we need to pay attention to these two laws, and particularly in the case of the Article 8 of the AUCL. Because it describes, for example, an administrative offense for business operators when giving bribes in form of money or property for the purpose of selling or purchasing commodities or services. And also in the case when offering a secret commission, such as, for example, any commission, but it's not properly recorded, for example, in the books or records of the company. Again, here, as before, bribe, the concept is still a little bit wide, a little bit vague. It could be almost anything. So in this case, for example, some interim provisions or interpretations provide more specific examples like travel or flight tickets. But also in the Article 7, for example, there are some points that I would like to highlight because it's important for businesses to bear in mind. One is that those bribes can cover both offering and accepting bribes. So no matter if you are a receiver or a giver, and also the liability. For the liability, we have two cases, for example, and I'll give you some examples here that I think it's important to understand. Because here what happened is, for example, in the first scenario is that you have an employer is liable for the illegal acts of its employees. If those acts were undertaken for the benefit of the employer. So in other words, let's say you have a company in China. Let's say you have a textile company, right? And then you have a manager in your company that decides to give, for example, a present, a travel trip to a resort to your manufacturer who is in the province of Guizhou, for example. And the purpose of this gift, this travel trip to this resort, is to obtain a large discount in the invoice for your next year production. So let's say this year, 2017. So what happened here? Your manager is giving a bribe to this manufacturer in Guizhou. But actually, the benefit is also for your company because you're getting a more favorable contractual condition, right? So liability will be for both, but including your company. Even let's say if the director or the general manager of the company is not aware of this. Then, for example, another case or variation of this will be if the legal act of the employee were for the employee's own benefit. but against the interest of the employer. So obviously here the employer won't be liable. And let's use the same example. Let's say your agent, your manager, for example, rather than providing this business trip, he gets a hongbao, so a red envelope with some money from the manufacturer. And the manufacturer, actually what he wants is from your manager to accept the production fees for this year, 2017. But what happened is those fees are 30% more expensive than another producer that you have, for example, in Yunnan. So in this case, obviously there is no favorable contractual conditions here for the employer. So the only beneficial here is your manager plus the manufacturer, right? So liability will be a very important aspect to bear in mind. Another article that I would like to highlight in the other slide, number 25, you will see the article 45. It correct. It's in Chinese, but I basically explain what it says. It refers to the mitigation and to the voluntary confesses, meaning, for example, a person that has committed a crime, but it's a relatively minor crime. Remains to be seen, by the way, what is a relatively minor crime, but in any case, it's considered relatively minor. And then this person, what it does, in order to be exempted from punishment or receive mitigated punishment, he exposed corrupt activities of others who can be involved in a bigger or major case. So this is quite significant matter that we will need to be aware as well when we were involved in an investigation case. If we move to the next slide, I would like to give you some examples because I think it's quite interesting always to see some examples. Well, here, as a generalist, like to basically try to differentiate what will be a gift without being considered a bribery, which can be a little bit difficult sometimes. But basically, if it's something is not too expensive or not too valuable, or there is a promotion, it wouldn't follow a bribery. Although this can be tricky sometimes because, let's say, for example, you offer a dinner to your distributor in Shanghai, and the amount is, I don't know, 200, 300 kuais per person, the dinner, right? But for example, the same amount, if you happen to go to Shanghai, for example, that will be a quite luxury dinner. So sometimes it might be a little bit tricky. So we should be informed of the local context, I would say, always. If we move to the next slide, here it comes a more specific example of a direct kickback scheme, and that is actually quite common, I could say, in China. This direct kickback, it's in the next slide, page 27. Here, let's say, imagine that you have a foreign company, right? It doesn't matter if it's a goofy or a joint venture, but let's say this company, for example, sells LED bulbs. It could sell whatever, but let's say LED bulbs. Then in this company, for example, you have a sales department, right? And then you have a sales agent or supervisor or manager, whatever, that gives a secret kickback to a purchasing agent that happen to work in an SOE. And the purpose, obviously, is to have a new order. Now, the funds for this kickback comes from, for example, fake receipts that this sales agent has submitted to the company, and then this money goes directly to the person working in the SOE, the purchasing agent. Therefore, once he gets the money, he pays a new order, right? So what we have here in this scenario is some people has benefit from this scheme. Obviously, we have the purchasing agent from the SOE who has received Hongbao, right, some money. Then we can say also the sales agent has some benefits because, for example, he has a new order, so has secured new businesses, therefore meet probably sales targets, and also maybe earn some bonus or even promotion, right? But here goes the third beneficiary here, who will be the entity, right? We mentioned before in Article 7 the liability. So be careful here because it's the company getting some beneficials and you might not be aware of this scheme. So for that, you will need to pay attention. Now, if we move to the next slide, there is a common question that people used to ask, and is that, okay, if everything happened in a kind of secret way, how come that the Chinese enforcement authorities might know about this bribes, right? Well, the answer usually is quite simple, and it's just one word, I would say, that you really need to pay attention to: whistleblowers. And who can be these people? It can be almost anyone. Here in the PPT, you can see common ones when it comes to competitors. For example, if your competition happened to listen some rumors, or is suspicious because probably they might also try to bribe the same official, or the same agent, but it could be also the person that you bribe that is unhappy with the amount, or maybe didn't receive the amount, or maybe thought it's not sufficient. But one of the most dangerous things that you really need to bear in mind is the people working in your own company. For example, unhappy employers, or people paying love, or dismissal people, because usually they have access to information and then they can inform authorities, right? So you should be aware of this situation. If we move to the next slide, we will see another example as we see that the law is getting enforcement in a more tight way. So for example, kickback schemes has become a little bit more sophisticated. So for example, let's say that a company now, a foreign company, for example, is suspicious that something fraudulent is going around. So it starts an internal investigation to see the roots of that and who is behind this. So then, for example, let's use the same example of the previous joint venture selling LEDs. So the sales guy decides to open a company, and for example, a travel agent, because there are few legal and capital requirements. So for example, let's say the sales guy, creates a fictitious trip for a business trip, and then or not, or maybe there is a trip, an actual trip, but what he does is to inflate the expenses, right? So for example, in this case with this fictitious bag. Or in a variation, maybe in a business trip, he sends the SOE employee to this trip that happens to be in a resort like Hong Kong and Macau, with some activities like going to golf or a casino or whatever. So again, here it will be also a violation of the law, and again, risk scenarios will be the same with blowers from your competition, from participants, even somebody that can say something in WeChat. So you really need to pay attention to these situations. If we move to the other slide, uh, we will go to another case that it was quite well known here in China last year. However, it was not as big as the pharmaceutical one. But I'm saying that we are running a little bit out of time, so I will jump to this next slide to just mention about the penalties. You can later on see the slides, right? But for penalties, you need to bear in mind two things. Penalties are different when it comes to private commercial bribery and official bribery. So for example, for commercial bribery, as you can see now, you have penalties for bribe receivers and also givers. And for givers, in the current criminal law, we include individual and entities, both of them. The monetary funds, as you can see, it goes to bribe giver, which is another of the points that we highlight before. And we compare these commercial bribery penalties with the official penalties. We will see that in official bribery, the penalties are much more severe because we have basically imprisonment for the bribe receivers. Could you please move to the page 32 so the audience can see the official bribery? Yes, exactly. Here, for example, if you see the bribe receivers, the punishment is much more severe because you have, for example, life imprisonment, but you can even have the penalty. So it's much more severe in the case of official briberies. Now, if we move to the next slide, we will arrive to the last category of bribery policies. Here we have some cases of the case numbers for briberies. You can see that there has been in 2014, especially in 2015, an increase in the numbers. However, for official briberies, numbers are quite stable, I would say. But if you move to the next slide, for example, and we see the commercial bribery cases, those are in crescendo actually. So that's why commercial briberies are very important for corporates, and particularly foreign corporates, because even if they try to be enforced for everyone, but usually in a short period or in the first term, in the short term, foreign companies are also, very to be investigated or prosecuted. If we move to the next slide now, yes, we will arrive to the foreign bribery, if I don't mistake, correct. So here, for example, in the foreign bribery, I would like to briefly mention some facts. In the next slide, we will see that with its obligations under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption are quite significant, and the law is designed to prohibit Chinese nationals from making payments to foreign officials. In other words, the punishment is in accordance with the provisions for commercial bribery. And here I will highlight, for example, obviously you might be thinking about Chinese corporates going abroad, or for example, involved in M&A transactions, right? However, the example I want to give you is one that you may not think about it, but you should. And this is, for example, a foreign company which has established a GUFI or a joint venture in China. When it does so, it becomes a legal entity and therefore it qualifies as a Chinese legal person, right? So when doing so, it has to fulfill the rights and the obligations under Chinese law. So let's say you have a GUFI in China or a joint venture in China, and then you want to expand your business to Southeast Asia. It doesn't matter if it's, for example, Vietnam or Indonesia or Myanmar. The thing is, if you send an employee to those countries, and that employee could be a Chinese or could be a foreigner, and this person makes a payment to a foreign official to secure a contract for the purchase of goods or services, then your company will be violating Article 164 of the criminal law, of the Chinese criminal law, right? Because the payer works for a Chinese legal entity. So this is also a good example to bear in mind that sometimes we forget. If we move now to the next slide, we will arrive to measures that a companies can take or can pay attention when dealing with anti-bribery and anti-corruption matters. And first of all, I would like to mention 2 points that I think are key. One is that your top level management really needs to be committed to take the suitable measures for your specific company and business. I think this is important. And the other one is to have a legal in-house or external, if you don't have a legal department, counsel with obviously experience in the Chinese context. This is also another must. If we move to the next slide, we will see 3 different areas that your company could pay attention to or could try to work with in order to avoid risks or to prevent them, actually. So obviously the first one will be to have programs. So write or establish clear and comprehensive guidelines, policies, and procedures, including also the implementation of them, and even to point out somebody that follow up and you know, make sure that all your employees know those guidelines or policies. Then it would be also advisable to have investigations, could be internal, could be external. It depends also, for example, the size of your company, how big it is, or if you already have some suspicious that something might happen. It could be also a compliance audit, very specific, so you require an external party to carry out. But it's also advisable due to the fact that when Chinese authorities start an investigation because somebody informs that there's a possible crime, if you're not prepared in time, or if you're not prepared in advance, it might be a very unpleasant, I could say, situation for the company. And the last one will be compliance. It's very important to have an annual risk assessment for any company. So for example, your company could create a compliance program and also designate a senior compliance officer to be in charge of it. If you happen to have already compliance programs from other markets, then what you could do, for example, is to adapt them to the Chinese context, right? For example, is to set up policies for travel and entertainment. Also to review the commercial content structures and penalties. This is also important. And definitely to do trainings to your employees and staff and management. Tip: do not treat this bribe or corruption as a matter of concept, right? Because that they're doing a favor to the company, that they're helping the company to grow and to do business. So it will be more advisable to specify actually what happened, the result of doing those bribes. So for example, dismissals or enforcement of the authorities, etc. So that will be much more effective. If we move to the next slide, I'll try to finish quickly now. Well, here, what happens sometimes is, particularly SMEs, but in general, many foreign companies, they think they are very strict, right, with their own internal guidelines. However, it is important to think in the effects of an investigation, right? So, for example, what are the damages that bribe could cause to your company? So the reputational damage is one of the key ones, I could say, because it will not only affect your image in China, it probably will affect your image in other markets and also towards your consumers. So you really want to avoid this situation. Also because cross-border placements, we all know it's quite easy to have inappropriate payments. So it's important to have programs to reduce this risk. Same thing if you want to go as a listed company, you will need to disclose material and information for investors, right? So it's important that all your records are excellent and very clean. And nevertheless, obviously, when operating with China, in China, within China, or with Chinese companies, you need to comply with Chinese law firms, with Chinese laws and regulations. So finally, as a conclusion, I could say that laws has been improved regarding anti-bribery and anti-corruption in China. If we move correct to the next slide. However, it doesn't mean that they are not happening. Still is on place. Therefore, it's important for the companies to pay attention to this risk and also, or even more, because the liability that it could be to the link to the corporate. Even more, something that I didn't mention that could be interesting to pay attention is because, for example, violations to the Chinese laws could trigger investigation from other prosecutors, like other jurisdictions. Let's say, for example, the Americans, they really pay attention of what's going on in China. So, for example, if you're an American company and something happened here, it could trigger another investigation back home. So you definitely want to avoid that. And you can do a lot of things to prevent. So prevention goes always better than solving problems. So my advice to you is pay attention of what's going on and try to learn what are the most suitable measures to implement in your company. I have finished the presentation for this topic today. Hope it was clear and interesting to everybody. So I would like to thank you, all of you, for listening. And if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mariah. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in during the presentation. The first question is, do you see nowadays more foreigners, more foreign employees or Chinese employees accepting bribes in China? And if yes, are the foreigners treated differently compared to the Chinese when they are caught?
Well, I would say that it's not there are more foreigners than Chinese. However, what it happened is like, as I mentioned before, right? In a short or in a first period of enforcement of these laws, foreign companies are a bit more what you call for. Also linked to the fact that currently the economy situation it's a bit less. It is more competitive, so it's less nice than before. So the competition is very fierce. It's extremely fierce, and as we mentioned, many authorities need to investigate potential or possible crimes when somebody informed that it could be a crime. So what happened is with this, for example, whistleblowers, is that, for example, your competitor might know or might suspect that your company is, involved in some type of bribe or corrupt behavior, so they will inform authorities, and therefore the authorities must intervene. Once the authorities inform, cannot not intervene. So in this sense, foreign companies might be in the spot of many whistleblowers, but I couldn't say authorities just or focus more in foreign companies. And the fact is, if we see that the cases for commercial cases, and they are involved both foreign and Chinese companies, domestic companies. The other thing is also when it comes to compliance, because anti-fair competition law also is linked to compliance. And here the thing is, nowadays laws and regulations are changing very much and very rapidly. So actually sometimes less easy to follow up on those, and especially if they are, for example, SMEs, and they might not have a legal department or legal counseling, no matter if it's external. So they, it might be the case that they don't comply with the law, although it might not be intentionally, but it might happen. So in that case, it could be perceived as such, but I don't think so based on the case numbers. The other factor that we need to consider is media. It is very, let's say for the party, it's not very pleasant to have party members in the media for corruption cases or scandals, right? But if we have some foreign company on the media that can set out an example to other companies, and no matter if they are foreigners or Chinese, this is very useful, very, very helpful, right? So definitely it will be no hesitation in trying to spread the voice around the media with foreign cases. Even it might be less number, but at the end they will be more in the media. So, and that's why I was saying this is a key factor to be reminded for the reputation of your company, because you might be more exposed to that. So that, yes, definitely you need to be careful.
Mariah, since employers are responsible for the behavior of the employees, especially corrupt behavior, how can you as a shareholder, investor, or a member of the board or legal representative protect yourself and your company against this type of behavior?
Correct. For that, I was mentioning some of the measures, right, that a company can take, and that is a key issue. I think there are 3 key measures that I already mentioned, but I will highlight it again. One is to have in place guidelines, policies, and procedures, very clear, and to appoint somebody that follows them, like monitors them and the implementation of them, and to make sure that all the employees know these policies and procedures. So you must train those employees. And also, for example, they might identify some, corrupt behaviors. If that is the case, do internal investigations, spend money in internal investigations, because it's better if your company does. This is very important. And that could be also for the same thing for compliance audits. Compliance are very important too. And it could be also, even if it's an external, for example, criminal investigation, it could be also very useful in order to avoid those risks. Now, as bigger is a company or a corporate and as much branches you have, those risks might be higher. Therefore, those guidelines or procedures are highly important, and the training that you provide your employees, and then the person or the department, if you have a legal department, appointed to monitor the implementation of those procedures are highly important, very, very important.
Well, Mariah, we'll leave it there because we've just hit 6 o'clock. I want to thank you very much for joining us. If people have further questions or attendees have further questions for Mariah, please do contact her directly. Her contact information was on an earlier slide. Don't hesitate to reach out to her. If you would like for me to make a formal introduction, I'd be more than happy to. Just shoot me an email, and I will make a formal introduction to Mariah. Just some last-minute admin. We have our last webinar within this webinar series, which is going to be taking place tomorrow. It is on how to exit China successfully. If you are interested, please don't hesitate in subscribing to it. Last but not least, if you've enjoyed our webinar series, or you're interested in getting further complimentary information, please do so on our website or subscribe even to our weekly e-newsletter by simply inserting your email address in the homepage section of our ChinaInvest.biz information series. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you and goodbye.